If you've ever been stopped by the police and asked to roll your window down, or maybe even up, you might wonder, can I refuse? Can I actually say no to the officer? And if I do, what can I do to protect myself from what the officer might do next? In this video, I'm breaking down how to protect yourself in 3 key situations. Number 1, when officers want to check your window tint and they demand that you roll your window up so they can use their window tint meter. Number 2 is when officers insist that you roll your window down all the way during a traffic stop. And number 3, what happens if you refuse entirely? Can the officer break your window and pull you out of the car? Standing up for your rights in these situations is extremely important, but you also want to protect yourself just in case the police don't follow the rules. So let's dive in. First, can cops force you to roll up your window so that they can use their tint meter to check your window tint? I had this actually happen to me years ago, but it's an actually fairly common scenario where police officers drive by your car and they may think that your window tint's a little too dark. So what do? They use it as a basis to pull you over for a traffic stop. Maybe then you roll down your windows all the way so that he's not able to actually see your tint. Can the officer then demand that you roll all of your windows back up so they can actually check your tint and put the tint meter on the window itself? Better yet, what if the officer then starts asking you to do a bunch of other things? Like, hey, turn on your front headlights. I want to make sure they were working. I think maybe one of them wasn't working when I drove by earlier. Or honk your horn. Or hey, I want to make sure you tap your brakes. I want to make sure everything's operational in your car. Can the officers actually require you to do these things? Not necessarily. You've got to understand, when an officer wants to put a tint meter on your window to see what the level is, that is considered a search under the Fourth Amendment. Just like it's normally considered a search if the officer wants you to start doing things like turning on your lights or honking your horn. So we now have to analyze, if it's a search, does the officer have a legal basis to require you to comply with his request? The Supreme Court case of United States versus Jones says that when police trespass onto protected property with the intent of gathering protected information, that is considered a search under the Fourth Amendment. So am I saying that the cops could be trespassing onto your vehicle? Yes, I am. Think about what they're doing. They're walking up to your car, they're touching it, they're manipulating it, they're trying to take the actual window and put a device on it to see what it registers. Another example is I found a case where a parking enforcement officer chalked someone's tires trying to measure whether or not they had overstayed their parking time on their meter. That was ruled to be a search under the Fourth Amendment. In another case, a Texas state trooper actually pounded on the tire of a vehicle with the intent to determine whether or not there was something inside of it. That was also considered a search. So where does this leave us? If we now know that this is considered a search for the officer to actually check any of these things on your car, we now have to see if the officer can justify that search. And in order to justify the search, there's really only 3 ways they can do that. Number 1 is they must either have your consent. Number 2, they must have some type of recognized exception to a warrant. Or number 3, they must have a valid search warrant. Remember, these are the very basic protections you receive under the Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution. First, why give consent? You can always give consent, but if you want to stand up for your rights, you need to understand that under our Constitution, you always have a right to refuse consent to any search under the Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution. So we'll throw the consent one out the window and we won't talk about that. The second one is a valid warrant. Look, if they're pulling you over, wanting to do a window tint test on your actual window using one of those meters, there's no chance they have a valid warrant yet. So now that brings us to an actual exception to that warrant requirement. The most common recognized exception that cops will use in this type of situation would be the motor vehicle exception to a warrant. Now here's the issue. In order for this officer to use the motor vehicle exception requirement to a warrant, he's going to have to establish some type of probable cause that your window tint was too dark, and he had to have established that probable cause before he actually walked up to your car. So that's with him driving by or something like that. So here's the question. What exactly is the officer going to say to establish probable cause that he had a reason to believe some criminal activity was taking place? Will he say that he saw what he thought was a total blackout of the windows? Or will he get up on the witness stand and in his report say that he actually pulled you over to verify if your window tint was legal? This will greatly depend upon your jurisdiction. But if the officer writes in his report or he testifies that he just wanted to verify that your actual tint met the standard for state law, there's a very good chance that was an illegal search. Because at this point, that's a mere hunch. An officer drives by and he thinks maybe your window tint's a little off. He uses that now as a pretext to pull you over. He's going to have more than just saying, well, I just wanted to verify it. And so as a result of that, it's really important to understand it's going to be based very much on what the officer is able to articulate. Now, what about cops telling you to turn on your headlights or to honk your horn or check all the other equipment on your car? Unless your state has a specific regulatory law in place that allows police officers to conduct equipment safety checks on your actual car as part of a normal traffic stop, this would be considered an illegal search for the officers to do this. And I want you to think why. Think about this. Otherwise, officers could just claim they pull you over and it's a pretext stop, now just wanting to check everything on your car to see if they can find any defective equipment. And if they do, what can they do? They can now cite you, they could now possibly arrest you, and then they could do a search incident to arrest. This is what we call a regulatory search. So in order for this type of equipment check to be legal, there needs to be a law in place that provides notice to the public that having an equipment check is a normal part of a routine traffic stop. Otherwise, cops pulling you over just to check the equipment on your car would be outside the scope of a reasonable traffic stop. Therefore, it would be an illegal search. Now, here's one to watch out for, though. What if you're from one state and you're traveling to another state? And the classic example I'll use here is, let's say you live in Arizona and you're traveling to California. Does your Arizona car have to be in compliance with the window tint law in California? That's exactly what happened in People versus Nybar. In this case, the defendant was cited for a window tint violation under California Vehicle Code Section 26708. The defendant argued that the statute was unconstitutional as applied to him because he was in compliance with Arizona's window tint law. However, the court not only upheld the traffic stop, but also the citation. They emphasized that vehicles traveling in California must comply with California law, regardless of where you actually have your vehicle registered. So watch out when traveling. Cops can use this window tint issue as a pretext to pull you over, possibly cite you, which could then lead to them questioning you and possibly searching you or your car. So window tint, cops must have probable cause. Safety checks, looking at the equipment on your car, there must be a regulatory law already in place in your state that would allow them to do this. Otherwise, it's an illegal search. Now, can cops order you to roll down your window during a traffic stop? I see police do this all the time, particularly if a police officer pulls you over for a traffic stop and he walks up and maybe it's late at night, he can't see too easily inside the car, or maybe you have those tinted windows we were talking about. Can an officer actually make you roll down your window to have the interaction with him to provide your driver's license and your insurance? Now, here is what we know. Under Pennsylvania versus Mims, if the officer can articulate how his officer safety is at risk, he can actually require you to get out of your car. The frustrating thing is that courts have given broad discretion to police officers on what it takes to justify their officer safety being at risk. So I'm saying that to say this: if an officer demands that you get out of your car, it's almost always going to hold up in court. We also know that under Maryland versus Wilson, the passengers can also be ordered to get out of the car as well. In fact, the Supreme Court says that being ordered to get out of your car is, quote, minimally intrusive to you and to anyone else in your car in order to preserve officer safety. Like it or not, that's exactly the law. Understanding that is the law, you know the police officer is going to argue that because it's minimally intrusive for you to get out of your car for their officer safety, it's also minimally intrusive for you to roll down your window all the way for their officer safety. And by the way, you can choose not to roll down your window all the way, but if you don't roll it down, what do you think the officer will do? They will now claim that their officer safety is at risk. They'll say that because of your attitude or your behavior or your demeanor, or maybe they thought you were acting in a furtive way, making furtive movements in the car. Now they believe strongly that their officer safety is at risk. And now under Pennsylvania versus Mims and Maryland versus Wilson, you got to get out of the car. But wait, What if instead of arguing over the window, what if the officer doesn't like something about me and he tries to force open my door? Can he legally open my door? Cops can only legally open your door if they plan on trying to force you out of the car. They cannot open your door to look around and see what else is going on, and they certainly cannot open your door to try to trap you in so that you can't shut your door. Cops must have a legitimate reason to open your door. Merely wanting to see your hands better or not being sure exactly what else is going on in the car does not establish a legal reason for the officer to ever open your door. But be careful here. If the officer does open your door, think about what's going to happen. Let's just play it out as the way this really goes. If you start to kind of panic and he opens your door and you say no and you shut the door, one of the things you'll find officers will many times do is they'll say that you began to make furtive movements. You acted in such a way that placed them and their safety at risk, and now they could justify getting you out of the car, which means what? They'll now force your door open and force you out of the car. Now, what if all of this leads to a stalemate? What if you have your window up and the officer demands you get out of the car? You refuse to get out of the car. Can the officer actually break your car window in order to force you out of the car? Now, here is a classic scenario I have seen happen literally dozens and dozens of times. Let's say an officer pulls someone over for a traffic stop. He then walks up and claims he smells the burnt odor of marijuana. He now demands that the individual not only roll down their window, but that they open their door and get out of the car. What does the person do? What does the driver do? They roll up their windows and they refuse to get out of the car. The driver then starts recording everything with his phone and he locks the door. Can the officer legally now break that car window and force them out of the car? Now, I don't like this, but this has happened many, many times all over the country, and most courts uphold this as a legitimate action by the police. First, regardless of whether marijuana is legal in your state or not, if an officer claims he smells the burnt odor of marijuana and you're in a car at that time, that gives him all the legal basis he needs in order to force you to get out of the car to do a full DWI investigation. Why? Because having any marijuana in someone's system, in the driver's system, at the time of operating a vehicle can be the basis for a DWI. And in all states, operating a vehicle while intoxicated on marijuana is a misdemeanor crime. But on top of all of that, I can guarantee you those police officers are going to claim that by rolling up the window, refusing to get out of the car, this was furtive movements. It was behavior that was, they believed, criminal, and as a result of that, placed the officers in fear for their safety. And here's the key. Officers will then claim that they were justified in using force not against the actual driver, but against the vehicle itself. All they did is merely remove the barrier between the driver and the officer. Now, I don't like this, and I believe police officers should de-escalate this situation, and the last thing they should be doing is breaking windows and yanking people out of the car. But I do want you to understand, this is a common technique that many police officers will use in this situation. What about lowering your window slightly, just enough for the officer to hear you and for you to pass the officer your driver's license and your insurance as required by your state's laws? Now, I want you to know you can absolutely do this, but it's important for you to scope out your situation. Do you have other people in the car? Are your windows tinted? Is this a nighttime traffic stop? If so, by keeping your window higher, just be aware of this, many times officers will now use the surrounding circumstances of what's going on. Particularly, let's say there's somebody in the back seat and they start moving around, or someone's quick, they make a quick movement. That officer is going to immediately use those circumstances as a basis for them to argue their officer safety is at risk. And now not only you, but all of the passengers in the car are going to be forced out of the vehicle. Finally, if you choose to exit the car, the smart move here and the protective way to go about it is to lock your car doors as you get out of the car. This is completely legal to do. And the moment you lock your car door, the officer is going to have a separate probable cause in order to ever get back in. Now, will the officer like it? Oh no, he won't like it at all. He won't like your behavior or your attitude, and he may try to claim that it establishes some type of reasonable suspicion, but it is absolutely your right to do so. Now, the only way for that officer to get back into the vehicle after you've locked it is either your consent, which is only going to come if you open your mouth, which I'm going to tell you right now, you should always exercise your right to remain silent and do not answer any questions unless you have a lawyer present during the entire process. But secondly, even if they try to claim that there is some type of exception to the warrant requirement, they're going to have to establish some type of exigent circumstances. And what would that be? Maybe it has to be with the officer establishing that he believes you were involved in some type of criminal activity where you might be armed and dangerous. He would have to articulate that there is an actual strong reason to believe that he could search for that particular weapon within the vehicle. Otherwise, there's no way he's going to be able to get back into that vehicle unless he has a valid search warrant. Now, what if cops pull you over and start saying things to you that make you feel like, man, maybe this guy's lying, or maybe he's trying to trick me? Check out this next video where I break down police lies and just plain dumb questions and the 10 best responses you can use. See you over there.